Today you wake slowly, the way people often do when the world outside is still quiet and the morning has not yet fully decided to begin. For a moment you remain still beneath a heavy blanket, listening to the faint sounds around you and trying to understand why everything feels slightly unfamiliar. Nothing is loud or alarming, yet something in the air feels different. You are a young male traveller of the high Middle Ages, lying on a straw mattress inside a 13th century medieval roadside inn. The smell reaches you first. It is not unpleasant, but it is thick and layered in a way that feels foreign to modern life. Instead of the neutral scent of clean fabric or fresh air through a window, the room carries the mingled traces of wood smoke, damp wool, old timber, and straw that has rested for many nights beneath travellers who arrive tired and left again at dawn. Which is to say, it smells like a medieval inn, a rather authentic one from the High Middle Ages. The ceiling above you immediately confirms that you are somewhere unusual. Thick wooden beams run across it at uneven angles, their surfaces darkened by years of smoke from fires that must have burned here through many winters. A pale grey light slips quietly through a narrow window, the sort that was never designed to brighten a room so much as to remind it that morning exists somewhere beyond the walls. Medieval architects, it seems, were not particularly concerned with natural lighting, or with level beams for that matter. For a few seconds you simply watch the light spreading across the rough stone floor, waiting for your mind to supply some reasonable explanation for where you are. But no explanation arrives. The room remains stubbornly unfamiliar, and yet there is a strange calm to the realization that follows. You're not simply far from home, you're far from your own time, and judging by the smell, quite far from modern plumbing as well. As your eyes adjust to the dim light, you begin to notice the other travellers sharing the room. A man near the far wall sits on a wooden bench pulling on thick leather boots, their sides stiff with dried mud from yesterday's road. Another traveller carefully tightens the cord of a worn satchel before resting it beside him, moving with the slow patience of someone who expects a long walk ahead. Or possibly the resigned acceptance of someone who knows there is no other option. No one looks surprised that you are here. No one asks questions. In fact, everyone seems to behave as though this quiet room full of travellers rising before dawn is the most ordinary thing in the world. Which, in the 13th century, it rather was. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, a bell begins to ring. The sound drifts across the quiet morning air with a steady rhythm that feels older than the road itself. Church bells mark the hours of daily life throughout medieval Europe, calling monks to prayer, signalling the opening of town markets, and reminding travellers that another day of walking had begun. They also served as the medieval world's alarm clock, snooze button not included. Hearing it now makes the stranger realization of your surroundings feel even more certain. You are standing inside a small roadside inn somewhere in the medieval world, perhaps in the early years of the 13th century, when long dirt roads connected villages and monasteries across a landscape that most people experienced only on foot. Cars would not be invented for another 700 years. Neither would proper roads, really. The room gradually fills with the quiet movements of travellers preparing to leave. A wooden door creaks open as someone steps outside to test the morning air. A faint gust of cold follows him back into the room, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and distant fields. He closes the door quickly. Apparently the morning has failed its audition. It is the kind of morning that belongs to people who walk for a living. Merchants who must reach the next town before sunset. Pilgrims travelling toward distant shrines along the pilgrim roads of medieval Europe. Messengers carrying news that cannot wait for comfort. And today, it seems, shortly you will be one of them, whether you intended to be or not. You, the young male traveller of this 13th century road. Leaning against the wall beside your bed rests a simple walking staff, the sort pilgrims often carried along long roads to steady their steps and ease the miles beneath their boots. A small satchel lies beside it, containing the sort of practical supplies a traveller might expect to need. A loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, a small knife, and a flask that smells faintly of watered ale, which was safer to drink than the water, though considerably less appealing than one might hope. None of it looks new. Everything appears used, practical, and entirely suited to the long road ahead. Which raises a quiet but rather important question. Where exactly does that road lead? And perhaps more pressingly, why do you, a traveller dressed like a man of the medieval road, appear to own medieval travelling equipment? Pilgrims in the Middle Ages rarely travelled without purpose. Some walked to famous shrines said to hold the relics of saints. Others journeyed to monasteries where prayers might be offered for a sick family member or a troubled harvest. Many travelled simply because the road itself offered a rare opportunity to leave familiar fields behind and see the wider world, even if that wider world was measured one village at a time. The medieval definition of adventure had somewhat modest parameters. For the next 48 hours you will share that road with them. You will walk through farmland where frost still clings to the hedgerows in the early morning light. You will pass merchants guiding wagons filled with wool and grain, monks travelling between abbeys, and farmers who have spent their entire lives within a few miles of the villages they now reluctantly leave behind for a journey of prayer. You will almost certainly develop blisters. Along the way there will be muddy paths, small bridges, quiet forests, and roadside taverns where travellers gather at night to share food, warmth, and stories that grow slightly more dramatic with every retelling. By the third tavern, that mild rain you walk through will have become a torrential storm, and the merchant's cart that broke a wheel will have been attacked by wolves. None of it will be fast. Medieval travel rarely was, but the slow rhythm of the road has a certain calm to it. A steady pace that allows the world to reveal itself gradually with every mile. Also, there is simply no way to make it go faster, so acceptance becomes a virtue by necessity. Outside, the church bell rings once more, its sound echoing softly through the cold air beyond the walls of the inn. If you listen carefully, you can already hear the faint movement of travellers gathering along the dirt road that leads away from the village. Boots on gravel, the creak of wagon wheels, the quiet murmur of people beginning on another day's journey. The resigned sighs of people who would very much appreciate a hot shower and a proper mattress. And somewhere beyond the door, waiting just past the first turn of the road, lies the beginning of your own. Try not to think too much about the blisters. The cold morning air meets you immediately as you step outside the inn. It is the kind of chill that wakes the senses faster than any alarm clock ever could, slipping beneath your cloak and reminding you that medieval mornings rarely begin with central heating. The village around you is already stirring, though not in any hurried or organised way. Instead, it wakes gradually, like a field slowly filling with light. The street beneath your boots is not paved with neat stone. It is packed dirt, deeply rutted from wagon wheels and softened by a last night's frost. A narrow strip of mud runs through the centre, where rainwater has gathered over the past week, and several chickens appear to have claimed it as their personal domain. One of them eyes you suspiciously before returning to the serious business of scratching at the earth for something edible. A few other travellers have already emerged from the inn and now stand quietly near the road, adjusting cloaks and tightening straps on their satchels. One man leans heavily on a walking staff while studying the horizon, as though he hopes the road might somehow shorten itself if he stares long enough. It will not. Medieval roads have many qualities, but generosity toward tired travellers is rarely one of them. Across the lane, a baker is already awake and working beside the open mouth of a clay oven. A faint glow flickers inside as he slides another small loaf into the heat with practiced care. The smell drifting into the cold air is immediate and unmistakable. Fresh bread, dark and hearty, made from coarse rye flour that will keep a traveller fed long after softer loaves would have crumbled into disappointment. You wander closer, drawn less by hunger than by curiosity. The baker glances up briefly, nodding in the casual way of someone who has seen many travellers pass through this village over the years. And there is little reason to ask questions when another one appears. You exchange a few quiet coins for a small loaf wrapped in cloth. It is warm enough that steam still rises faintly from the crust. Breakfast, it seems, will not be complicated today. Behind you, the indoor creaks again as another traveller steps into the morning light. This one wears a simple brown robe tied loosely at the waist with a cord, the sort often worn by monks travelling between monasteries. He pauses beside the doorway for a moment, looking down the road with the calm patience of someone who has walked it many times before. When he notices you studying the loaf in your hands, he offers a small smile. "A good purchase," he says quietly. The road is kinder when one begins it with bread. You suspect the road will not be especially kind regardless, but the bread certainly improves the odds. Beyond the village houses, the dirt road curves gently toward a low wooden gate set between two stone walls. It is not an impressive gate by any measure. There are no towering defences or iron bars waiting to slam shut. Instead, it seems designed mostly to mark the quiet boundary between village life and the long stretch of countryside beyond. Several other travellers are already making their way toward it. A merchant guides a small donkey loaded with wool bundles that sway slightly with every step. Two farmers walk together carrying tools over their shoulders, speaking in the slow, unhurried rhythm of people who have been awake since long before sunrise. And then there are the pilgrims. You can recognise them easily once you know what to look for. Their clothes are simple, their packs light, and many carry the same kind of walking staff leaning beside your own bed a few minutes earlier. Some wear small badges sewn to their cloaks, tokens collected from shrines visited along the road. One man proudly shows his badge to anyone willing to glance in his direction. Judging by the expression on the monk's face beside you, this happens quite often. You begin walking with the others toward the gate. The village wakes more fully with every step. Smoke begins rising from several chimneys as morning fires are lit for cooking. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks with great enthusiasm about something that almost certainly does not require such enthusiasm. A cartwheel creaks loudly as a farmer prepares to haul grain toward the next market town. Life here moves with the steady rhythm shaped by daylight, weather, and the quiet understanding that most journeys must be made on foot. No one seems especially concerned about covering great distances quickly. In truth, medieval travellers measure distance in a slightly different way than modern ones do. Today, for example, one of the pilgrims walking ahead announces confidently that the next village lies only a short distance down the road. The monk beside you raises one eyebrow. Experience has clearly taught him that medieval definitions of a short distance can vary wildly depending on optimism, weather, and how recently the speaker last attempted to walk there. Still, the group continues forward with quiet determination. Pilgrimage has never been about convenience. When you reach the wooden gate, you pause for a moment beside the stone wall and glance back at the village behind you. The inn where you woke now looks smaller than it did from inside, its timber frame leaning slightly with the patient weight of many winters. The baker continues his work, sliding another loaf into the oven, while smoke curls upward into the pale morning sky. It is an ordinary village by medieval standards, but it is also the beginning of the road. Beyond the gate, the land opens into wide farmland still dusted with frost. Low hedgerows divide the fields into uneven shapes, and a thin ribbon of dirt road winds gently between them before disappearing into the distant hills. Somewhere far along that road lie monasteries, shrines, markets, forests, and roadside taverns where travellers will gather tonight to share food and stories beside a smoky fire. For now, though, the road simply waits. You tighten the strap of your satchel, take another bite of warm bread, and step forward with the others as the small group of pilgrims begins its slow journey into the medieval countryside. The miles ahead will not be fast, but then again, the best roads rarely are. The wooden gate of the village closes softly behind you as the road begins to stretch into open countryside. For the first few moments, no one speaks. Travellers often begin the day this way, letting their feet find a rhythm before conversation finds its place. The quiet is not awkward. It simply belongs to the morning. The road ahead is narrow but well known. A long earthen track worn smooth by centuries of hooves, cartwheels, and countless pairs of boots much like your own. It winds gently between hedgerows that divide the farmland into long irregular fields, each bordered by tangled shrubs and low wooden fencing meant to persuade livestock to remain where they belong. The persuasion is not always successful. To your left, a patchwork of winter barley stretches across the pale ground, the frost still clinging lightly to the tips of the young shoots. A farmer farther out in the field bends over his work with steady patience, his cloak hanging loosely around his shoulders as he studies the soil. He glances briefly toward the road as your small group passes, raising a hand in greeting before returning to the quiet concerns of his morning. Travellers come and go often enough that curiosity rarely lasts long. Ahead of you, the merchant and his small donkey continue their steady progress along the centre of the road. The animal walks with the calm confidence of a creature that has made this journey many times before. Its burden, bundles of wool wrapped in coarse cloth, sways gently with every step, though the donkey seems entirely unconcerned by the arrangement. If anything, it appears mildly pleased with the pace of the journey so far. One of the farmers walking nearby glances at the animal and nods approvingly. A sensible traveller, he mutters quietly, though it is not entirely clear whether he means the donkey or the merchant guiding it. In medieval travel, the difference between the two can occasionally become philosophical. The road begins to rise gradually as it climbs a gentle hill beyond the farmland. From the crest you can see the countryside spreading outward in all directions, a landscape shaped more by patient labour than grand design. Fields, orchards, scattered cottages and distant tree lines form a pattern that has likely changed very little over the past 100 years. In the High Middle Ages, time moves forward slowly in places like this. Farther along the road, a pair of monks approaches from the opposite direction. Their robes are dark and practical, dusted lightly with the pale colour of the road itself. One carries a small satchel, while the other walks with the careful balance of someone protecting a rolled parchment tucked beneath his arm. They greet your group with a brief nod as they pass, exchanging the quiet courtesy that travellers often share with one another. Pilgrim roads are rarely empty for long. They connect villages, abbeys, market towns and distant shrines across wide stretches of countryside, and the travellers who use them form a constantly shifting community of strangers who share little more than the direction of their steps. Some will walk together for hours, others part ways after only a few minutes, their destination slowly pulling them toward different horizons. The morning grows brighter as the sun rises higher above the fields, though the warmth takes longer to arrive. A light breeze moves across the open land, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant farmhouses preparing their midday fires. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a rooster continues announcing the arrival of morning long after the rest of the world has accepted it. Walking along a medieval road teaches patience quickly. Distances that might seem small on a map reveal themselves to be far more ambitious when measured step by step. Villages that appear close on the horizon may take hours to reach, especially when the road curves unexpectedly through hills, forests, or farmland that refuses to follow a straight line. One of the pilgrims ahead pauses briefly to adjust the straps of his satchel before continuing. The motion is small but familiar. Travellers make these small adjustments constantly, tightening a strap, shifting a pack, or adjusting a cloak against the wind. The road has a way of revealing even the smallest discomfort eventually. Your own walking staff proves useful almost immediately. The ground beneath your boots changes often as the road crosses shallow dips and rises along the landscape. Some stretches are firm and dry, while others retain just enough moisture from recent rain to remind travellers that medieval roads were built more by habit than engineering. Careful footing becomes a skill learned quickly and practiced often. After an hour or so, the road narrows further as it enters a stretch of low woodland. The trees here are mostly oak and ash, their branches still bare from winter, but beginning to show the earliest hints of spring. Sunlight filters through the limbs in thin golden bands that move slowly across the path as the morning progresses. The forest brings with it a different kind of quiet. Wind moves more softly beneath the canopy, and the sounds of distant farms fade behind the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird somewhere high above the road. Even the travellers seem to walk a little more quietly here, as though the woods prefer a certain level of respect. A wagon approaches from ahead, its wheels groaning softly under the weight of several barrels secured with rope. The driver raises a hand in greeting as he guides the horse carefully around a patch of uneven ground. Passing wagons always require a small moment of negotiation on narrow roads like this, though everyone involved has clearly practiced the manoeuvre many times before. "Road's a bit muddy ahead," the driver remarks as he passes. "Nothing too terrible though, only swallowed one wheel yesterday." He continues on before anyone has the opportunity to ask which wheel it was, or whether the road had eventually decided to return it. Medieval travel often includes information delivered in this manner, brief, mysterious, and only mildly reassuring. By late morning, the road emerges from the trees and opens once again into farmland. In the distance, another village appears faintly along the horizon, its thatched roofs just visible beyond a line of low hills. It is too far away to reach before midday, but its presence offers a quiet reminder that the road is leading somewhere, even if the exact distance remains politely vague. The merchant's donkey continues its patient march ahead, the steady rhythm of its hooves setting a pace that no one seems particularly eager to challenge. Pilgrims have learned over many centuries that the road rewards endurance far more reliably than speed. You settle into the rhythm of walking, the staff tapping lightly against the ground with each step. The countryside moves slowly around you as the miles begin their gradual, almost unnoticeable accumulation. The journey, it seems, has truly begun. The road carries you onward for some time after leaving the woodland, bending gently across the open countryside as though it has grown comfortable with the land and sees no reason to rush through it. Walking becomes easier once the rhythm settles in, and before long, the quiet shuffle of boots, the creak of leather straps, and the steady tap of your walking staff form a kind of slow-travelling music shared by everyone on the road. The countryside ahead widens into rolling farmland, broken only by hedgerows, low stone walls, and the occasional lonely tree standing where a farmer long ago decided it was not worth the effort to remove it. Beyond the fields, the road begins to curve slightly toward a shallow rise in the distance, where something small and pale stands beside the path. At first, it appears little more than another weathered stone set along the roadside, though as you and the other travellers draw closer, the shape gradually reveals itself to be more deliberate than accidental. It is a shrine, or at least the modest version of one. A simple stone cross rises from a small base of carefully stacked rocks, its surface worn smooth by time and weather. Someone has placed a few small offerings at its base, a wooden bead bracelet, a pair of wilted flowers, and a candle that has long since burned itself into a small pool of hardened wax. The structure is neither grand nor particularly artistic, but it carries the quiet presence of something that has been visited many times by people who believed the road ahead might benefit from a little encouragement. Without anyone suggesting it aloud, the group of travellers gradually slows as they approach the shrine. A few pilgrims step aside from the road and remove their hats, bowing their heads for a moment of silent prayer before continuing onward. One older traveller rests both hands on the top of his walking staff and studies the cross thoughtfully, as though attempting to decide whether the road ahead deserves a prayer or perhaps a strongly worded complaint. The monk walking beside you pauses briefly and glances toward the shrine with the calm familiarity of someone who has passed this way before. He offers a small nod in its direction, neither stopping nor rushing, acknowledging it with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that the road contains many such places and that travellers often greet them in their own ways. These appear along many pilgrim roads, he says gently, his voice carrying the relaxed tone of someone explaining a simple fact rather than delivering a sermon. Some are built to honour saints, others are raised in memory of travellers who did not finish their journey, and some exist simply because someone once believed the road deserved a blessing. You study the small arrangement of offerings at the base of the cross again, and find yourself wondering how many travellers have paused here over the years. Hundreds, perhaps, possibly thousands. Pilgrim routes in the high Middle Ages often followed the same paths for generations, each traveller adding a small moment of presence to the long memory of the road. Nearby, the merchant with the donkey stops long enough to adjust the bundles of wool tied across the animal's back. The donkey itself takes advantage of the pause by investigating a patch of grass beside the road with great enthusiasm, apparently convinced that this particular stretch of countryside contains the finest vegetation in all of medieval Europe. One of the farmers glances over at the animal and chuckles quietly. "Best traveller among us," he remarks, though once again it remains unclear whether he means the donkey or the merchant guiding it. A younger pilgrim kneels briefly beside the shrine and places a small coin among the other offerings, before rising and brushing the dust from his knees. The gesture is simple and practiced, performed without ceremony but with the quiet seriousness of someone who believes that small actions may still carry weight along long journeys. Roadside shrines like this served many purposes in the medieval world. They remind travellers that faith and travel often walk the same road, but they also act as markers, gathering points and small places of rest where strangers briefly become companions. When a road stretches for many miles across unfamiliar land, even a small stone cross can feel like a reassuring sign that other travellers have passed safely before you. After a few moments, the group begins moving again, each traveller returning to the slow rhythm of the road. No one lingers for long, though the shrine remains visible behind you for several minutes as the path curves gently across the fields. Walking resumes its familiar pattern. Boots strike the packed earth with steady regularity, while the breeze moves softly across the farmland, carrying the distant sounds of farm animals and the occasional creak of a wagon somewhere beyond the hedgerows. The monk beside you glances ahead toward the road and adjusts the sleeve of his robe thoughtfully. Pilgrimage, he says after a moment, is often described as a journey of great devotion and spiritual reflection. He pauses briefly, watching the merchant guide his donkey around a patch of uneven ground. In truth, he continues calmly, it is also a great deal of walking. You cannot argue with this observation. The road ahead stretches patiently across the countryside, rising and falling with the shape of the land as though it has all the time in the world to reach its destination, which, in fairness, it probably does. Somewhere far beyond the distant hills lie towns, monasteries and shrines that have drawn travellers along these same paths for centuries. The road connects them all, winding quietly through fields and forests while the lives of countless pilgrims pass along its length. For now, however, the journey remains simple. There is the road, there are the travellers walking beside you, and there are many miles still waiting ahead. The road continues for several hours after the shrine disappears behind the slow rise of the fields, and the small group of travellers gradually stretches apart as each person settles into his own preferred pace. Pilgrim roads often begin the morning with companionship, but as the miles accumulate, the road gently rearranges everyone according to endurance, mood, and the quiet negotiation between boots and blisters. By late morning, the countryside begins to change. The fields grow smaller and more carefully tended, separated by sturdier hedgerows and low stone walls that suggest the land ahead belongs to a larger settlement. The road itself grows slightly wider as well, not because anyone has improved it recently, but because more carts and travellers have passed this way over the years, pressing the earth outward into a broader track. You notice the first sign of the town before you see it. The sound arrives first. At the far edge of the fields, a faint murmur begins to drift across the wind, a soft mixture of voices, wagon wheels, and the dull rhythm of tools striking wood somewhere beyond the hills. The noise grows slowly stronger with every step, until it becomes clear that the road ahead leads not to another quiet farming village, but to something busier. The monk walking nearby glances ahead and nods toward the rising sound. "Market day," he says simply. This explains several things at once. Medieval market towns often draw travellers from many miles around, especially on the 1 or 2 days each week when farmers, craftsmen and merchants gather to trade goods that cannot easily be produced at home. For people walking long distances, arriving at a market town before noon is considered excellent timing, since it means there is still bread, food, and perhaps even a seat at a tavern bench before the afternoon crowds arrive. The road begins to descend slightly as it approaches the town, curving down a gentle hill where the fields give way to scattered cottages and barns. A pair of boys drive several stubborn geese along the roadside, waving sticks in determined attempts to persuade the birds that the market square awaits their immediate attention. The geese remain unconvinced. As you pass, one of them pauses in the middle of the road and studies you with the stern expression of a creature that believes it has important responsibilities elsewhere. Eventually it decides that your presence is not particularly interesting and continues its slow march toward town. Ahead, the road passes beneath a simple wooden arch that marks the boundary of the market settlement. The structure serves less as defensive gate and more as a polite reminder that travellers are entering a place where people live, trade, and occasionally argue about the price of onions. Beyond the arch, the road widens into a lively street lined with timber houses, whose upper floors lean slightly toward one another, as though sharing quiet conversations above the heads of the people below. The market itself spreads across a broad open square at the centre of the town. Stalls have been set up beneath rough canvas coverings, their tables crowded with goods that reflect the practical concerns of medieval life. Baskets of apples and onions sit beside piles of rough wool cloth. A cooper displays wooden barrels stacked neatly in a careful tower that suggests both skill and optimism. The air carries a lively mixture of smells that shift with every passing step. Fresh bread from a baker's stall, smoked fish laid out on wooden boards, damp wool cloaks drying in the sun, and the faint, sharp scent of horses waiting patiently beside the well. The square itself is alive with motion. Farmers speak loudly with merchants while weighing sacks of grain. A blacksmith stands beside a small portable forge, tapping rhythmically at a horseshoe, while explaining to a customer why the previous shoe was clearly the horse's fault. Nearby, a group of children runs through the crowd chasing a small hoop with sticks, weaving between adults with the fearless confidence of people who have never been responsible for repairing broken pottery. You move slowly along the edge of the market square, taking in the scene with the calm curiosity of a traveller who has walked many quiet miles and now finds himself briefly surrounded by noise, movement, and opportunity. The monk pauses beside a bread stall and studies the display with quiet approval. The baker behind the table is a broad man with flour dusted generously across his apron and forearms. He looks up as you approach, offering a quick nod before turning his attention back to arranging loaves into neat rows. "These are fresh," he announces confidently to no one in particular, which is exactly the sort of statement every baker has made since the beginning of recorded history. You purchase another small loaf and a wedge of hard cheese, both of which disappear quickly into your satchel, with the quiet satisfaction of supplies acquired before the road demands them again. Travellers in medieval Europe learn to eat when food appears rather than when hunger insists, since the distance between meals can sometimes depend on little more than luck and the location of the next village. At the far end of the square, a wooden sign swings gently above the door of a tavern, whose windows glow with the warm, dim light of a fire burning inside. The sign itself shows the painted image of a cup and a loaf of bread, a clear and honest promise that travellers entering this establishment will likely find both. The monk follows your gaze and smiles faintly. "A brief rest would not be unreasonable," he says. Inside, the tavern is dim but welcoming. A low fire burns in the hearth while several travellers sit along wooden benches sharing bowls of stew and quiet conversation. The air smells strongly of barley, onions, and the unmistakable comfort of food that has been simmering long enough to forgive nearly any ingredient. You find space along a bench near the wall and set down your satchel. For the first time since leaving the village behind that morning, the road pauses long enough for the world to feel still again. Outside, the market continues its lively rhythm of voices and trade, but here in the tavern the sounds soften into a background murmur that blends easily with the crackle of the fire. The road will continue soon enough, but for now the journey has reached its first true stop. The tavern grows quieter as the last of the midday meals are finished, the earlier noise of bowls, benches and voices settling into a softer murmur that belongs more to resting travellers than hungry ones. Outside, the market square continues its steady rhythm of trade and conversation, but the road beyond the town waits with the quiet patience that roads have always possessed. Travellers, after all, rarely remain indoors for long when miles still lie ahead. You step back into the daylight where the market noise folds around you once more. A cart rattles past toward the square, while a pair of farmers argue politely about the proper value of a sack of onions. The smell of fresh bread drifts through the air again, mingling with the sharper scent of horses and damp earth. Market towns in the high Middle Ages often feel briefly like the centre of the world, yet the roads that feed them never stop drawing people onward. The monk beside you pauses only long enough to adjust the cord around his robe before glancing toward the road leading out of town. "The afternoon will be easier if we begin soon," he says calmly. This is the sort of observation that sounds like gentle advice, but is in fact a practical truth. Medieval travellers quickly learn that the sun sets whether the road cooperates or not, and arriving at the next village after dark is rarely anyone's preferred adventure. You leave the market square behind and follow the road as it slips between rows of timber houses and small workshops. The town gradually loosens its grip on the landscape as the buildings thin into scattered cottages, then barns, and finally the familiar openness of farmland once again. The road ahead bends gently along the edge of a shallow valley, where the land dips toward a narrow river, winding quietly through the fields below. From a distance you can see the faint line of a stone bridge crossing the water, its arch rising just high enough to carry carts and travellers from one side of the valley to the other. Several people are already approaching the crossing from different directions. A pair of farmers leads a wagon loaded with sacks of grain, while a small group of pilgrims walk steadily along the opposite side of the road, their staffs tapping lightly against the packed earth with each step. Bridges like this one are important landmarks along medieval roads. In a world where travel depends largely on the willingness of rivers to cooperate, a reliable crossing becomes more than just a convenience. It becomes a gathering point where travellers pause briefly before continuing in whichever direction their journey demands. As you draw closer, the quiet sound of water moving beneath the bridge becomes clear, its steady flow carrying the faint sparkle of afternoon sunlight across the stones. The river itself is not wide, though it moves with enough determination to discourage anyone from attempting a careless crossing elsewhere. A narrow wooden shelter stands beside the entrance to the bridge, its roof leaning slightly with the patient exhaustion of many seasons. Beneath it sits a man on a low stool beside a small wooden table that holds a box, a ledger, and an expression suggesting he has been watching travellers approach bridges for quite some time. The monk glances toward the table and smiles faintly. "Maintenance," he says. The man at the table looks up as you approach, nodding in greeting while resting one hand comfortably on the small wooden box. "Bridge toll," he announces with practiced efficiency. This is not an unusual request. Bridges require upkeep, and in medieval Europe that responsibility often falls to monasteries, towns, or whoever happened to build the structure in the first place. Travellers contribute a small coin in exchange for the privilege of crossing safely, which most people consider a reasonable arrangement, given the alternative of attempting to persuade a river to behave politely. You place a coin on the table and receive a small nod in return. The toll collector glances toward the road behind you where another wagon slowly approaches. "Careful in the middle," he adds casually. "The stones can be slick." This is the sort of advice that arrives just late enough to be mildly concerning. You step onto the bridge with the others, the stone surface worn smooth by generations of hooves and wheels that have crossed this same arch over the years. Beneath your feet the river moves quietly through the valley, its current sliding past the bridge supports with a steady patience that suggests it has seen far more travellers than the road above ever will. Halfway across, one of the pilgrims pauses briefly to look over the low stone wall at the water below. "It seems peaceful," he remarks. The monk beside you glances down at the river and nods. "Rivers often are," he replies, "until they are not." This appears to be the entire explanation. Once across the bridge, the road climbs gently out of the valley and returns once again to open countryside. The afternoon sun now hangs higher in the sky, casting long bands of light across the fields, where farmers continue their steady work. The road ahead narrows again as it begins to follow the curve of the land toward a line of distant trees. The air grows quieter once more as the sounds of the market town fade behind you, replaced by the softer rhythms of countryside travel. A breeze moves across the fields carrying the scent of grass and distant wood smoke. Somewhere far off, a dog barks briefly before losing interest in the matter entirely. Walking resumes its familiar pattern. Boots strike the packed earth with steady regularity, while the road winds patiently ahead through farmland and hedgerows that have watched travellers pass for generations. The monk adjusts the sleeve of his robe thoughtfully as he studies the road stretching toward the distant trees. Pilgrimage, he says after a moment, has many lessons. He walks a few more steps before continuing. One of them is that the road is rarely in a hurry. You glance ahead where the path disappears slowly into the quiet countryside, its winding course promising more miles, more villages, and eventually another evening shelter somewhere beyond the horizon. For now, however, the afternoon belongs to walking, and the road continues patiently onward. The road continues for some time after leaving the river valley behind, rising gently across the countryside as the afternoon settles into its slower, quieter rhythm. The warmth of the sun now sits comfortably on the fields, softening the chill that greeted the morning travellers many miles earlier. Walking has become almost automatic, the steady pattern of steps and staffs forming a rhythm that requires very little thought once the body has agreed to cooperate. Pilgrim roads often feel longest in the late afternoon. The energy of the morning has faded, the midday rest has passed, and the next place to sleep still lies somewhere beyond the next hill, or perhaps the next one after that. Medieval travellers rarely measure distance in precise miles. Instead, they learn to watch the position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the slow appearance of smoke rising from chimneys somewhere ahead. The first sign that the day's walking is nearing its end comes not from the road itself, but from the fields beyond it. A thin line of smoke drifts upward in the distance, barely visible at first against the pale sky. A few minutes later, the faint shape of rooftops appears along the crest of a low rise, where the road bends slightly toward a cluster of buildings gathered close together. The monk walking beside you notices it at the same moment. That, he says calmly, is either an inn or a place that wishes it were one. As the road carries you closer, the buildings gradually resolve into a small roadside settlement built where several narrow tracks meet. The structure nearest the road is a broad timber building with a sloping roof and a wooden sign swinging slowly above the door. The painted image on the sign is simple but unmistakable. A cup beside a loaf of bread. It is, without question, an inn. Travellers appear to have reached the same conclusion. A small cart stands beside the entrance while two horses are tied to a hitching post nearby, their heads lowered contentedly as they investigate the serious work of chewing hay. A narrow yard beside the building holds a few scattered benches where several travellers sit stretching tired legs and comparing the quiet aches that accompany a day spent on the road. One man removes his boots entirely and studies his feet with the careful attention of someone considering whether his relationship with walking may need to be renegotiated. The monk glances at the inn and nods once. "This will do." The door opens easily, and the warm air inside greets you with the familiar mixture of smells that mark a well-used medieval inn. Wood smoke curls upward from a hearth set along one wall, while the scent of stew drifts through the room in slow, comforting waves. Somewhere beneath those stronger aromas lies the unmistakable presence of damp wool cloaks drying near the fire. A few travellers already occupy the benches scattered round the room. A pair of merchants sits near the hearth quietly discussing the condition of a road several miles north, while a lone traveller near the window studies a bowl of stew, with the patient concentration of someone who's been walking all day and is now determined to enjoy the reward. Behind a long wooden table stands the innkeeper, a broad man whose expression suggests that he has spent many years watching travellers arrive hungry and depart early. He looks up as you enter and gives a short nod that manages to welcome you, while also reminding you that stew, bread and ale are unlikely to appear without reasonable compensation. You find space along a bench near the hearth, where the warmth reaches easily without becoming overwhelming. The monk settles beside you and removes his satchel with a quiet sigh that suggests even experienced travellers appreciate the moment when walking finally ends for the day. The innkeeper soon appears with 2 wooden bowls filled generously with barley stew. The surface glistens with bits of onion and carrot, while several pieces of salted pork float quietly beneath the broth like small treasures waiting to be discovered. Food rarely tastes better than it does at the end of a long day on the road. Around the room, conversation drifts easily between travellers who may never see one another again after tonight. Stories about distant towns mingle with complaints about muddy roads, stubborn weather, and the general unfairness of hills that appear unexpectedly when one least desires them. A man near the door tells an enthusiastic story about a wagon that nearly lost a wheel earlier that morning, though the details grow slightly more dramatic with every retelling. The monk listens quietly for a moment before leaning slightly toward you. Travel stories, he says softly, tend to improve with distance. You suspect this is entirely accurate. Near the far wall, a narrow staircase leads upwards to a row of small sleeping rooms where travellers will spend the night. The beds inside are little more than wooden frames topped with straw mattresses, though after a full day of walking, even the simplest arrangement begins to feel like a luxury. For now, however, the warmth of the hearth and the steady comfort of food are more than enough. Outside the windows, the afternoon light begins its slow descent toward evening, casting long golden bands across the yard where the horses stand quietly beside the inn. The road itself stretches beyond the building and disappears into the fading light of the countryside. Tomorrow it will call travellers forward again, but tonight the journey pauses here, and for the moment that is entirely acceptable. The night passes quietly in the small room above the inn, the kind of sleep that arrives quickly when the body has spent the entire day walking. Travellers in the Middle Ages rarely required elaborate arrangements for rest. A dry roof, a wool blanket, and the absence of rain drifting through the window were usually considered more than acceptable circumstances. By those standards, this particular night has been a generous one, and the kind of generosity travellers learn not to question too closely. Sometime before dawn, the room begins to stir with the slow movements of people who have travelled long enough to wake before the sun without needing any encouragement. One man sits up and pulls on his boots with the careful patience of someone negotiating with sore muscles that have formed strong opinions about yesterday's hills. Another traveller folds his blanket neatly before gathering his satchel, moving quietly so as not to disturb the few who are still enjoying the last moments of sleep that remain before the road calls everyone back to its familiar duties. The faint grey light of morning slips through the small window beside your bed, gradually revealing the familiar shapes of the room once again. The beams above still hold the dark stain of many winters' worth of smoke, while the floorboards carry the soft creak that belongs to buildings which have spent many years supporting tired travellers who arrive at dusk and depart again before the day properly begins. Downstairs, the first sounds of the innkeeper preparing the morning fire drift upward through the ceiling. A kettle is placed somewhere near the hearth, and a moment later the quiet rustle of kindling follows as the fire begins its daily effort to convince the room that warmth will soon return. The smell of wood smoke slowly reaches the sleeping room above, carrying with it the promise that breakfast will not be terribly far away. The monk nearby has already risen and stands near the window adjusting the cord of his robe. He glances outside briefly before turning back toward the room. "The road will be cold this morning," he says, though his tone suggests this information is offered more as a friendly observation than a warning. Pilgrims, after all, quickly become familiar with cold mornings. You sit up slowly and begin the familiar ritual of preparing for another day of walking. Boots return to their rightful place, satchel straps are tightened, and the walking staff once again becomes a practical companion rather than a decorative object leaning beside the wall. These small preparations feel almost automatic now, the quiet routine of travel settling into place with the same calm rhythm as the road itself. The other travellers complete similar preparations with the quiet efficiency that often develops among people who understand the rhythm of the road. There is very little conversation, though the occasional nod or small greeting passes easily between those who shared the same shelter overnight and now prepare to return to their separate destinations. Downstairs, the room near the hearth has already begun to gather a few early risers. The innkeeper stands beside the fire turning several small loaves of bread across a metal grate while a pot of porridge simmers slowly beside it. The soft bubbling of the pot blends with the crackle of the fire, creating the sort of comforting morning soundtrack that belongs to places where travellers often begin their day. Breakfast in a roadside inn rarely involves complicated decisions. You take a seat at the long wooden table while the monk joins you nearby. A bowl of warm porridge arrives soon afterward, accompanied by a piece of bread that has been toasted just enough to develop a respectable crust along its edges. Around the table, several travellers eat quietly, while discussing the road ahead in the relaxed tone of people who are still deciding how enthusiastic they feel about beginning another day's journey. The man near the hearth mentions a village several miles ahead, where travellers often stop to refill water flasks. Another traveller insists that the road beyond that point becomes easier, though his explanation contains the sort of optimism that tends to appear whenever people are discussing hills they have already climbed rather than the ones still waiting patiently ahead. The monk listens patiently before finishing the last of his porridge. "In my experience," he says calmly, "roads become easier primarily when they are behind us." No one argues with this observation. Outside the inn, the sky has brightened into the pale blue of early morning. A thin layer of frost still clings to the grass along the yard, while the horses tied near the hitching post breathe soft clouds into the cool air. Their quiet snorts and shifting hooves provide the sort of background sound that seems perfectly appropriate for the beginning of another day on the road. Travellers begin gathering their belongings and stepping back onto the road one by one, each person quietly resuming the journey that paused here only a few hours earlier. Cloaks are adjusted, satchels lifted into place, and walking staffs tested briefly against the ground as though confirming that the road remains exactly where it was left the night before. You follow them into the morning light where the countryside stretches outward in calm silence. The road itself looks much the same as it did yesterday evening, winding patiently between fields and hedgerows that appear entirely unconcerned with how many miles travellers must walk today. The monk pauses briefly beside the door to pull his cloak tighter against the morning chill before glancing toward the road ahead. "Pilgrimages," he says thoughtfully, "often feel longest on the second day." You ask why. "Because," he replies with a small smile, "on the first day we still believe we might be finished soon." The road waits quietly beyond the inn, curving across the countryside toward another stretch of fields where the morning light rests gently along the hills. Somewhere in the distance a rooster offers a final announcement that morning has arrived, though the travellers already appear well aware of the fact. You adjust the strap of your satchel and begin walking once more. Behind you, the inn slowly fades into the distance, its roof becoming smaller with every step until it blends into the patchwork of farms and cottages scattered across the valley. Ahead lies another day of steady travel. Pilgrims move along the road with calm determination, their staffs tapping lightly against the packed earth as the countryside opens before them. The journey continues as it always has, 1 mile, 1 field, and 1 quiet step at a time. The road carries you steadily onward through the quiet countryside as the morning slowly grows into day, and the frost that lingered along the hedgerows at sunrise begins to soften beneath the gentle warmth of the sun. Moisture gathers along the tips of the grass where the light touches the fields, leaving the land glimmering faintly as though the countryside itself is waking slowly after a long and patient night. Walking feels easier now that the body has accepted the simple truth that the journey continues, and the familiar rhythm of boots against packed earth gradually settles into place once more. Pilgrims and travellers move along the same winding road, some walking beside you for a time before slowly drifting ahead or falling behind as the miles quietly rearrange the company of the journey. These shifting partnerships are one of the quiet habits of medieval travel, where a person may share several hours of conversation with someone whose name they never learn, only to part ways at the next bend in the road without ceremony or regret. The road rarely insists that travellers remain together, yet it often allows them to walk side by side long enough to share a story, a loaf of bread, or a brief observation about the condition of the hills ahead. The path bends gradually across the countryside and climbs toward a low rise, where the land opens into a wide view of the fields beyond. From the crest you can see the long ribbon of road stretching outward through farmland and hedgerows before disappearing slowly into the distant horizon, where another cluster of cottages rests among a small stand of trees. The countryside carries the calm steadiness of a landscape that has watched generations of travellers pass through without ever feeling the need to hurry them along. The monk walking beside you pauses for a moment near the top of the hill and studies the view with the thoughtful calm of someone who has spent many years moving from one road to another. "Pilgrim roads rarely surprise us," he says in a quiet voice that blends easily with the breeze moving across the fields. "They simply continue in the direction they have always been going." You consider the thought while watching a farmer guide a horse slowly across a distant field, the steady motion of the plough turning the soil in patient lines that stretch across the earth. The countryside appears much the same as it did the day before. The same narrow tracks wind between the fields, the same scattered cottages sit quietly beside their gardens, and the same wide sky spreads above everything with the calm confidence of something that has observed centuries of journeys unfolding beneath it. Yet the road itself no longer feels quite as unfamiliar as it did when you first stepped outside the inn 2 mornings ago. The first miles of a journey often carry uncertainty, but time and distance have a way of softening that feeling until the road begins to resemble something more like a companion than a stranger. You understand its pace now, the way it rises and falls across the countryside without apology, the way it bends patiently toward villages, rivers, and distant hills before continuing onward with quiet determination. Walking becomes far easier once a traveller stops asking the road where it intends to lead. The monk adjusts the strap of his satchel and resumes walking beside you, his staff tapping gently against the ground with each step as the path carries both of you forward across the open fields. Many pilgrims believe the purpose of a journey lies in the place where it ends, he explains after a few minutes, speaking in the relaxed tone of someone sharing a lesson that has taken many years to understand. Yet the road itself often teaches something different, because the road is less interested in endings than it is in the act of continuing. Ahead, the path approaches a small wooden bridge where a narrow stream winds quietly through the valley floor. The boards creak softly beneath the weight of passing travellers, though the structure itself holds steady with the quiet strength of something that has served its purpose for many years. Beneath the bridge, the water moves gently around the stones, slipping through the grass with the steady patience that rivers have always possessed. You pause briefly along the railing and glance back along the road behind you, where the countryside stretches across the distance in a long line of fields, hedgerows, and scattered farmhouses. Somewhere beyond those distant hills lies the village where the journey first began, along with the inn where the smell of wood smoke and straw quietly announced that the world around you belonged to another time. Since then, the road has carried you through fields, past shrines and market towns, across bridges and into warm taverns where travellers gathered to rest before continuing onward once again. Each small moment has become a part of the larger journey, forming the quiet pattern that defines life along medieval roads. Travel in the High Middle Ages rarely rushes anyone toward a destination. Instead, the road reveals itself slowly, mile by mile, through the simple details that gather along the way. A farmer raising his hand in greeting from a distant field, the warmth of bread purchased at a busy market stall, and the quiet comfort of a fire burning inside an inn at the end of a long day, all become part of the memory of the road. These small experiences accumulate gradually until the journey itself begins to feel larger than any single place along its path. The monk notices you studying the road behind you, and smiles with the quiet understanding of someone who has watched many travellers reach the same realization. Most travellers begin their journey believing they are walking along the road, he says gently, as both of you step down from the bridge and return to the path winding through the fields. He gestures lightly toward the countryside that stretches outward in every direction. In time, they discover that the road walks with them. The afternoon sun now rests comfortably above the hills, casting long bands of light across the farmland, where the slow work of the day continues without interruption. Somewhere ahead, another village waits beside the road, and with it another inn where travellers will gather around a hearth before sleep returns once again. Beyond that village, the road will continue across the countryside just as it has for centuries, carrying pilgrims and wanderers through fields, forests, and quiet towns whose names change, while the road itself remains much the same. You continue walking beside the monk while the countryside unfolds patiently around you, the gentle sound of boots against packed earth blending with the wind moving through the hedgerows. Behind you, the road stretches across the fields in a long, quiet line that marks the path of the past 2 days. Ahead, it disappears slowly beyond the rise of the next hill, where tomorrow's miles already wait. The monk studies the distant horizon for a moment before resting both hands lightly on the top of his walking staff. He speaks with the calm certainty of someone who has watched many journeys unfold across his many roads. The road continues tomorrow, he says quietly, and in that moment you understand that it always has and always will. We tell calm, factual stories from history and to fall asleep to or to think about long after. The fire burns quietly now, its small orange light moving gently against the dark walls of the room. Most of the travellers have already fallen asleep, their long day on the road ending in the simple comfort of rest that follows steady walking and honest fatigue. Outside, the countryside has grown silent beneath the night sky, and the roads that carried so many footsteps today lie empty for the moment, waiting patiently for morning to arrive once again. It is easy to forget how important roads were in the medieval world. In our own time, travel often feels effortless, something measured in hours or even minutes. But in the High Middle Ages, the road shaped nearly every journey a person might take. Merchants followed it to market towns. Monks travelled it between monasteries. Messengers carried news across its long distances, and pilgrims walked its winding paths toward shrines that lay sometimes hundreds of miles from home. For most people, travel happened at the pace of footsteps. A road in the medieval world was not simply a way to reach another place. It was a living connection between villages, fields and distant cities that many travellers might only see once in their lives. Walking along such roads meant sharing the journey with strangers who came from places you had never visited and might never visit again. Yet for a brief time you walked beside them. You shared the same hills, the same dust beneath your boots, and the same search for shelter when evening began to fall. Conversations began easily on the road, sometimes lasting only a few miles before the path curved and each traveller continued toward his own destination. That was the quiet rhythm of medieval travel. A pilgrim might walk beside a merchant for several hours, then pass a group of monks heading in the opposite direction, and later share a bench in a tavern with farmers who had come to town for market day. Roads created these brief gatherings of strangers who shared nothing except the path beneath their feet. And yet those moments mattered. Pilgrimage itself held a special place in medieval life. Some people walked the pilgrim roads seeking forgiveness for past mistakes. Others travelled to pray for health or good fortune, and some simply wished to see the world beyond the fields where they had spent most of their lives. The journey itself often became the most important part. Walking for days or weeks across the countryside gave travellers time to think, time to pray, and time to see the world in a way that could never happen from behind the walls of a single village. The road had a way of slowing life down. When a person travels at the pace of walking, every hill becomes noticeable. Every river crossing matters. The arrival of a small town at the end of a long afternoon feels like a genuine achievement rather than a minor stop along the way. Perhaps that is why pilgrim roads became such powerful symbols during the Middle Ages. They reminded people that life itself often resembled a journey more than a destination. Each day brought its own stretch of road, sometimes easy, sometimes muddy, sometimes unexpectedly beautiful. Travellers learned to accept the path as it came, trusting that somewhere ahead there would be another place to rest, and another morning waiting beyond the horizon. Even now, centuries later, the old roads still exist. Many have become modern highways or quiet country lanes, but if you follow them carefully you can still trace the paths that medieval pilgrims once walked across fields, forests, and distant hills. The footsteps themselves are gone, of course, but the roads remember. And somewhere, on a quiet stretch of countryside beneath the same wide sky, the path continues onward, just as it always has, waiting patiently for the next traveller to appear around the bend. The fire burns a little lower now, as the room grows quieter still. Morning will come again, and when it does the road will be waiting,